The monastery bells had fallen silent 3 years ago, their bronze tongues stilled by hands that would never ring them again. But on this particular morning, as frost painted intricate patterns across the valley below, a different sound drifted through the abandoned cloisters, the steady rhythm of a boy's footsteps, and the soft whisper of pages turning in the cold air. His name was Thomas, though few remained who remembered to call him by it. 14 winters had passed since his birth, and for the last 3 of those winters, he had walked alone through corridors that once echoed with the chanting of dozens of voices. The great pestilence had taken them, or the abbot with his kind eyes, Brother Michael who had taught him his letters, even young Brother Peter who had been barely older than Thomas himself. They were gone, and yet Thomas remained, moving through the stone halls like a ghost himself, tending to tasks that no longer seemed to matter in a world that had been emptied of meaning. He carried a book under his arm as he walked, its leather cover worn smooth by countless hands over countless years. The pages within held words in Latin, and though Thomas could read them well enough now, he often wondered what purpose remained in preserving knowledge when there seemed to be no one left to share it with. Still, he carried the book, because Brother Michael had once told him that books were more than words on parchment, they were vessels of hope, containers that held the accumulated wisdom of those who had come before, waiting patiently for those who would come after. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And, if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The morning light filtered through windows that Thomas had learned to repair himself, casting colored shadows across the flagstones where he walked. He had risen before dawn, as he always did, not because anyone required it of him, but because routine was the thin thread that kept him tethered to sanity. In the kitchen he had prepared a simple meal from the monastery's dwindling store's bread. He had baked himself cheese from the few goats he still tended in the upper pasture, water from the well that he lowered the bucket into each morning, listening to the echo as it descended into darkness. The monastery stood on a hillside overlooking what had once been a prosperous valley. From the high windows of the chapel, Thomas could see the remains of the village that had sustained the religious community for generations. Stone cottages with collapsed roofs, fields returning to wilderness. A church steeple that leaned at an unnatural angle after fire had weakened its foundations. Sometimes when the wind blew from the south, Thomas imagined he could still smell the smoke, though 3 years had passed since the last of the villagers had either fled or succumbed to the sickness that had swept through the land like an invisible army. He made his way to the scriptorium, a room he had come to love above all others in the vast complex of buildings. Here, the monks had spent their days copying manuscripts, preserving texts both sacred and secular, their careful hands transforming blank parchment into repositories of learning. The desks stood empty now, but Thomas had claimed one near the window as his own. He set down the book he had been carrying and carefully opened a different volume. One he had been working on for months, a chronicle of the monastery's final days. Brother Michael had begun the chronicle, his handwriting growing increasingly shaky as the illness took hold of him. Thomas had found the unfinished manuscript beside the old monk's bed after he died, and something in him had decided to continue the work. Perhaps it was foolish, this desire to record events that no one might ever read. Perhaps it was prideful to imagine that his words mattered. But in the act of writing, Thomas found a kind of solace, a way of making sense of the senseless. He dipped his quill in ink and began to write, describing the changing seasons, the way the orchard trees had blossomed that spring with no one to harvest their fruit, how he had taught himself to tend the beehives when the monastery's honey stores ran low. His letters were not as elegant as Brother Michael's had been, but they were clear and steady, and he took care to form each word with precision. This discipline, too, was a form of hope, a declaration that order still mattered, that beauty still held value, even when the world seemed determined to collapse into chaos. The morning passed in this quiet occupation, broken only by the need to tend to the animals. Thomas had kept alive what livestock he could manage: 3 goats, a handful of chickens, and 1 old cow whose milk had become thin with age, but still provided enough to supplement his diet. He moved through these tasks with practiced efficiency, speaking softly to the animals as he worked. They seemed to appreciate his voice, the way it broke the oppressive silence that otherwise dominated the hillside. It was afternoon when Thomas noticed the smoke. He had climbed to the bell tower, as he did most days, to survey the valley below. From this height he could see for miles in every direction, the forest to the north, dark and impenetrable, the river to the east, winding like a silver thread through abandoned farmland, and to the south the road that led toward distant cities he had never seen. For 3 years, that road had remained empty, a ribbon of pale stone disappearing into the horizon with no travelers upon it. But today, there was smoke. It rose from the forest's edge, thin and grey against the autumn sky. Thomas watched it for a long time, his heart beginning to beat faster. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. In 3 years, he had seen no sign of human life beyond the monastery walls. He had wondered, sometimes, if he might be the last person alive in all the world, the final survivor of a catastrophe so complete that it had erased humanity itself. The smoke suggested otherwise. Thomas descended from the bell tower, his mind racing with possibilities and questions. Who would be camping in the forest? Travelers, refugees, bandits. The stories Brother Michael had told him about the chaos that followed. The plague's first wave had been grim tales of lawlessness, of desperate people doing desperate things, of social bonds dissolving as survival became the only imperative that mattered. Thomas had been fortunate in his isolation, protected by the monastery's remote location and its reputation as a place of death. But now, someone was out there. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of heightened awareness, pausing frequently in his work to listen for sounds that did not belong to the hillside's usual rhythm. He heard nothing unusual, just the wind moving through the empty buildings, the goats bleating in their pen, the chickens scratching in the dirt. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the smoke in the forest had opened a door that had been closed for years. That night, Thomas did something he hadn't done since the last monk died. He barred the monastery's main gate. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams of voices calling to him from the forest. Words he couldn't quite understand, echoing through trees that seemed to stretch upward into infinite darkness. He woke before dawn, as always, but this time he felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation churning in his stomach. The world he had known for 3 years, solitary, silent, predictable, was about to change. He could feel it the way animals sense coming storms. He climbed again to the bell tower as the sun rose, and this time he saw more than smoke. There were figures moving on the road. They were still distant, mere shadows against the pale stone, but they were unmistakably human. Thomas counted 7 of them, walking in a loose group, and as he watched through the clear morning air, he saw that one of them was pushing a small cart. They moved slowly, with the careful deliberation of people who had been traveling for a long time and had learned to conserve their strength. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. After so long alone, the sight of other people stirred something in him that he had thought deader, longing for connection, for conversation, for the simple comfort of not being the only voice speaking into the void. But alongside that longing came fear. He knew nothing about these travelers, nothing about their intentions or their character. The world that existed now was not the world he had known before the plague. He watched them approach throughout the morning. They moved with purpose, following the road that wound up the hillside toward the monastery. There was no mistaking their destination. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He had perhaps an hour before they reached the gate. In that hour, he needed to decide what kind of person he wanted to be, the kind who opened doors, or the kind who kept them barred. Brother Michael's voice seemed to echo in his memory, words the old monk had spoken during one of their last conversations, when fever had already begun to cloud his thoughts. The measure of a man, he had said, gripping Thomas's hand with surprising strength, is not found in what he does when life is easy, but in what he chooses when every choice feels impossible. Hold to love, Thomas. Whatever comes, hold to love. Thomas descended from the tower and walked to the gate. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the heavy bar and set it aside. The iron hinges creaked as he pulled the gate open, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet morning. Then he stepped back and waited, his heart hammering against his ribs as the travelers drew near. They reached the monastery entrance perhaps 20 minutes later. The first figure to step through the gate was a woman, middle-aged, with dark hair streaked with grey and eyes that held a wary intelligence. She stopped when she saw Thomas, and the others gathered behind her. 3 more women, 2 men, and a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. For a long moment, no one spoke. They simply looked at each other. These survivors of catastrophe meeting on a hillside that had become an island of persistence in a sea of ruin. Thomas noticed details in that stretched-out silence, the threadbare quality of their clothes, the hollowness in their cheeks that spoke of insufficient food, the way they held themselves with a kind of exhausted vigilance that came from traveling through dangerous country. The dark-haired woman was the first to break the silence. "Is this monastery still inhabited?" Her voice was rough, as if she hadn't used it much recently, but there was kindness in it, and hope. Thomas found his own voice, rusty from disuse. "I live here. I'm alone. I have been for 3 years. Something flickered across the woman's face, surprise, perhaps, or sorrow. "You've survived here by yourself, a boy your age." "I'm 14. I was 11 when the others died." The words came out flat, a simple statement of fact, but Thomas saw the impact they had on the travelers. The little girl pressed closer to one of the women, who he realized must be her mother. "My name is Margaret," the dark-haired woman said. She gestured to the others. "This is Elizabeth, Sarah, and Anne. The men are John and Robert. The child is Lily. We've come from the east, from the ruins of what used to be called Ashford. We've been traveling for weeks, looking for anything, somewhere to rest, somewhere safe. When we saw this place from the valley, we thought." She trailed off, and Thomas understood what she meant. They had thought they might find sanctuary here, or at least shelter. They had thought they might find hope. Thomas looked at the 7 faces before him, at the exhaustion and desperate optimism written there, and he made his choice. "You're welcome to stay," he said quietly. "There's room enough, and food, though not as much as there once was. I can show you where you can sleep, and we can share what there is." He saw the relief wash over them like a wave, saw shoulders relax, and eyes brighten with something that might have been tears. Margaret stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture both grateful and protective. "Thank you," she said simply. "You don't know what this means." But Thomas thought perhaps he did. He understood what it meant to find light in darkness, to stumble upon unexpected grace when you had resigned yourself to emptiness. He had experienced it himself 3 years ago, when Brother Michael had stayed with him to the end, instead of fleeing, had chosen to face death rather than abandon a frightened boy. That act of love had sustained Thomas through the long seasons of solitude that followed. Perhaps now it was his turn to offer the same gift to others. He showed them through the monastery, pointing out the kitchen, the dormitory where they could make beds, the well in the courtyard. They moved through the spaces with a kind of reverence, touching the stone walls as if to confirm they were real. Thomas realized that these people had probably been living rough for weeks or months, sleeping in abandoned buildings or beneath the open sky, never knowing from one day to the next if they would find food or shelter or safety. The monastery, with its solid walls and stocked larders, must seem like a miracle to them. That evening, they gathered in the refectory for the first communal meal the room had seen in years. Thomas had helped the women prepare food from the monastery stores, and the smell of cooking had filled the cold halls with warmth and life. As they ate, the travelers began to tell their stories, words tumbling out as if released from long imprisonment. Margaret had been a merchant's wife in Ashford, a woman of some means and education. The plague had taken her husband and 2 of her 3 children. She spoke of this matter vaguely, with a kind of controlled grief, that Thomas recognized the tone of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required the temporary suppression of unbearable pain. Elizabeth and Sarah were sisters who had lost their entire family. Anne had been a servant in a great house until the house's inhabitants died and she found herself alone among corpses. John had been a blacksmith, Robert a farmer. Little Lily was Anne's daughter, born just before the plague arrived, her early years marked by loss and constant flight. They asked Thomas about his own story, and he told them what he could about the monastery before the sickness came, about Brother Michael and the other monks, about the lonely years that followed. He found it harder than he expected to put into words, this experience of being the last witness to a community that had vanished. The travelers listened with attention and compassion, and Thomas felt something in his chest loosening, a knot of isolation beginning to unwind. After the meal, as darkness settled over the hillside, they sat together in the refectory's warmth. Margaret asked Thomas about the books in the scriptorium, and her eyes lit up when he told her about the library the monastery had maintained. "I can read," she said, almost shyly. "My father believed daughters should be educated as well as sons. I've missed books terribly." John mentioned that he had some skill with metalwork, and his gaze had lingered on the monastery's gates and hinges, many of which were in need of repair. Robert talked about the untended fields he had seen in the valley below, and wondered aloud whether they might be made productive again if someone had the will to try. The women discussed the monastery's herb garden, which Thomas had tried to maintain but which had suffered from his inexperience. They spoke of possibilities, of futures, of the small practical steps that might transform this refuge into something more permanent. Thomas listened to their voices weaving together in conversation, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. The monastery had been his prison and his sanctuary, but it had also been profoundly lonely. Now suddenly, it was filling with life again, with the energy and noise and comforting messages of human community. That night, lying in his small cell, Thomas heard the sounds of other people settling down to sleep. Throughout the building, quiet footsteps, low voices, the creak of bed frames that hadn't been used in years. It was strange and wonderful, this evidence of other lives moving parallel to his own. He thought about Brother Michael's words about love and choice, and he felt grateful that, when the moment came to decide, he had chosen to open the gate rather than keep it barred. The days that followed established new rhythms. The travelers proved to be industrious and skilled, each contributing according to their abilities. John worked on the monastery's various mechanical and metal elements, repairing hinges, fixing the well's pulley system, sharpening tools that had grown dull. Robert examined the land with a farmer's expert eye, identifying which of the monastery's fields might be restored to cultivation, which fruit trees in the orchard could be saved with proper pruning. The women took over the kitchen and began the work of organizing the monastery's stores, rationing carefully while also planning for future harvests. Margaret spent hours with Thomas in the scriptorium, and he found in her a teacher as patient as Brother Michael had been. She knew things about the world beyond the monastery that broadened his understanding. The names of distant cities, the history of the kingdom before the plague, the complex web of trade and politics that had once connected communities across vast distances. She also began to help him improve his reading and writing, correcting his Latin pronunciation and introducing him to texts he hadn't known existed. Little Lily was fascinated by everything, her child's curiosity undimmed, despite the hardships she had endured. She followed Thomas everywhere, asking endless questions about the monastery and the monks who had lived there. He found himself telling her stories, painting pictures with words of the community that had existed before the plague, and in the telling, those memories became clearer and more precious to him. Lily's presence reminded him of what had been lost, but also of what might yet be saved, the possibility of innocence, of joy, of a future worth building. 3 weeks after the travelers arrived, Thomas was working in the orchard when Margaret approached him. The autumn day was bright and cool, and he had been picking the last of the season's apples, fruit that the trees had produced without any human tending. Margaret helped him for a while in comfortable silence before she spoke. "We've been talking," she said carefully, "about what comes next, about whether we should stay here permanently, or whether this is just a temporary refuge before we move on." Thomas felt his stomach clench. He had known this conversation would come eventually, but he had pushed it from his mind, unwilling to face the possibility of being alone again. He forced himself to keep picking apples, to maintain the steady rhythm of the work, even as anxiety churned inside him. "What have you decided?" he asked, proud that his voice remained steady. "We'd like to stay," Margaret said, and Thomas felt the tension drain from his body. "If you'll have us, this place has been good for us, and we think we could be good for it. But this is your home, Thomas. You were here first. You've kept it alive when it should have died. We won't stay without your blessing." Thomas looked at her, this woman who had shown him such kindness over the past weeks, and he thought about what blessing really meant. It wasn't just permission, but a kind of grace and acknowledgement that good things were worth protecting, worth nurturing into being. Brother Michael had blessed him with the gift of knowledge and care. Perhaps now Thomas could offer his own blessing, could create the space for something new to grow. "I'd like you to stay," he said simply. "All of you. This place is too big for one person. It was meant to be a community." Margaret smiled, and Thomas saw relief and gratitude in her expression. "Then we'll stay," she said. "We'll make this work, together." And they did. As autumn deepened toward winter, the small community found its rhythm. They established routines and responsibilities, divided labor according to skill and strength. Robert began the work of preparing the fields for spring planting, enriching the soil with compost from the animals, clearing away the weeds and brush that had encroached during years of neglect. John completed repairs throughout the monastery, and then began to teach Thomas the basics of metalworking. Patient lessons in the courtyard, where they set up a small forge. The women preserved food for the winter months, pickling and drying, and storing away provisions with careful planning. They held meetings in the refectory each week, discussing decisions that affected the whole group. It was Margaret who suggested this practice, drawing on her memory of how her husband's merchant guild had operated. Thomas was struck by how different this was from the monastery's old hierarchy, where the abbot made decisions and the brothers obeyed. This new arrangement felt more democratic, more respectful of each person's voice and perspective. They talked about everything from how to ration the remaining grain, to whether they should try to make contact with other potential survivors, to what they would do if more refugees appeared at their gates, seeking shelter. On that last question, they were unanimous. The gates would remain open. They would share what they had with those in need, within the limits of sustainability. They had all benefited from this policy. After all, Margaret's group had found sanctuary here, because Thomas had chosen compassion over fear. To close the doors now would be to betray the very principle that had saved them. Winter came early that year, arriving with bitter winds and heavy snows that locked the monastery in white silence. But inside the thick stone walls, there was warmth and light, and the sound of human voices. They gathered each evening in the refectory, conserving candles by staying together rather than dispersing to individual rooms. John taught Lily her letters, tracing them in the air with his finger while she tried to copy the shapes. Anne and Sarah sang songs they remembered from before the plague, their voices harmonizing in ways that made Thomas's chest ache with a bittersweet mixture of sorrow and joy. Robert told stories about his childhood on a farm, tales of harvests and festivals that painted pictures of a world that seemed impossibly distant now. Thomas continued his work on the Chronicle, but now he had more to write about than just his own solitary existence. He recorded the arrival of the travelers, documented their skills and contributions, noted the small victories and setbacks of their efforts to create something sustainable. Margaret read what he wrote and made suggestions, helping him craft his observations into something more polished and purposeful. "You're writing history," she told him one evening, her finger tracing one of his careful sentences. "Future generations may read this and understand what happened to us, how we survived. Don't underestimate the importance of what you're doing." The words gave weight to his work, transformed it from a private meditation into something with potential public value. Thomas found himself writing more carefully, more deliberately, trying to capture not just the facts of their daily life, but the emotional truth of what it meant to rebuild community from the ashes of catastrophe. It was during one of the year's coldest weeks, when snow lay deep outside and the wind howled around the monastery stones, that the little girl fell ill. Lily woke one morning with a fever, her small body burning hot to the touch. Anne's face went white with terror, and Thomas understood immediately why. Illness meant the plague, illness meant death. Even years after the Great Dying, that equation remained etched into the minds of survivors. They moved Lily to a room by herself, following the quarantine practices that everyone had learned during the worst of the outbreak. Anne stayed with her daughter, refusing to leave despite the risk. The rest of them went about their tasks with a grim determination, but Thomas could see the fear in their eyes. They had found something precious here, a fragile oasis of normalcy, and now it seemed poised to shatter. Margaret came to Thomas on the second day of Lily's illness. "The child needs medicine," she said quietly. "Herbs that might bring down the fever, poultices that might draw out whatever poison is in her. I know something of healing, but we've used most of the monastery's medicinal herbs. The garden won't yield anything until spring." Thomas thought about this, about the stores of dried herbs in the infirmary, about Brother Peter, who had been the monastery's healer and who had taught Thomas a little of his craft. Then he remembered something else, the village below, the ruined cottages where people had once lived. Those houses had probably contained their own stores of herbs, their own small collections of folk remedies. The supplies might still be there, preserved by the cold and neglect. "The village," he said. "There might be something in the abandoned houses." Margaret looked at him sharply. "That's dangerous, Thomas. Those buildings could be unstable, and we don't know who or what might be sheltering there." "I know," Thomas said, "but if Lily dies because we were too afraid to try." He left the sentence unfinished, but Margaret understood. Sometimes the only choice was between risks, between different kinds of danger. Doing nothing was itself a form of action, and often the worst one. They decided that Thomas and John would go together, setting out at first light when the winter sun turned the snow pale gold. They carried empty sacks for whatever they might find, and John brought tools that could serve as weapons if needed. The walk down to the village took the better part of an hour, their feet crunching through snow that lay pristine and untouched. No one had walked this path in years. The village was even more desolate up close than it had appeared from the monastery heights. Thomas moved through streets he had seen only from a distance, past cottages with sagging roofs and doors that hung open like mouths frozen in permanent screams. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind whistling through broken shutters and the occasional collapse of snow from overburdened eaves. They searched methodically, John checking structural integrity before they entered each building. Most of the cottages were empty, long since looted by desperate survivors or simply abandoned in haste when the plague struck. But in one house near the church, they found what they were looking for, a small room that had clearly belonged to the village wise woman, its shelves still lined with jars and bundles of dried herbs. Thomas's hands shook slightly as he identified feverfew, willow bark, elderflower, chamomile. Some had lost potency with age, but others were still viable. They filled their sacks carefully, treating each find like the treasure it was. As they worked, John spoke quietly. "You're a brave lad, Thomas. Not many would have survived what you've been through, and fewer still would have opened their door to strangers afterward." Thomas felt his face warm despite the cold. "Brother Michael taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Your brother Michael sounds like he was a wise man." "He was. I miss him." The words came out more raw than Thomas had intended, and he felt John's large hand settle gently on his shoulder, gesture of understanding that required no words. They made their way back to the monastery as the winter sun began its descent toward the western hills. Margaret was waiting for them, and her face lit up when she saw what they had brought. She immediately set about preparing remedies, grinding herbs and mixing them with hot water, creating the bitter teas and aromatic poultices that might help Lily fight whatever sickness had taken hold. The next 3 days were tense and frightening. Lily's fever spiked and fell in alarming cycles, and Thomas heard Anne weeping softly during the night, the sound carrying through the stone corridors. He found himself praying, something he hadn't done much of since the monks died. The prayers felt awkward, rusty, but he offered them anyway, formless appeals to whatever force might be listening, whatever power might take pity on a child who had already suffered too much in her short life. On the 4th morning, Lily's fever broke, and emerged from the sickroom with tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of relief. The little girl was weak and pale, but she was asking for food, complaining about being confined to bed, all signs that she was going to recover. Margaret's remedies, combined with the child's own resilience, had pulled her back from the brink. The community celebrated that night with a special meal, breaking into their precious stores to create something that felt festive, despite the sparse ingredients. Lily sat wrapped in blankets, accepting everyone's attention with the matter-of-fact grace that children sometimes possess. Thomas looked around the refectory at the faces of these people who had become his family, and he felt a fierce gratitude that threatened to overwhelm him. This was what Brother Michael had meant, he thought. This was what love looked like in practice, not grand gestures or eloquent words, but the daily choice to care for others, to risk comfort and safety for the sake of community, to open doors and brew medicine and share scarce resources even when fear whispered that you should hoard and hide and protect only yourself. Winter slowly released its grip on the hillside. The snows melted, revealing the brown earth beneath, and the first signs of spring began to appear, green shoots pushing through soil, birds returning to nest in the monastery's eaves, longer days and softer light. The community turned its attention to the work of preparing for the growing season ahead. Robert organized the planting, drawing on his years of agricultural experience to plan what they should cultivate and where. They had seeds saved from the monastery's old stores, and more that Margaret's group had carried with them during their travels. They debated the merits of different crops, balancing nutritional needs against growing conditions and storage potential. In the end, they settled on a mixed grains for bread, vegetables for variety, herbs for medicine and flavor, flax for fiber. Thomas worked alongside the others in the fields, his hands learning the rhythm of planting, the proper depth for seeds, the careful spacing that would give each plant room to thrive. The work was hard and repetitive, but there was something deeply satisfying about Ita's sense of participating in something fundamental, of cooperating with the earth's natural cycles, rather than existing apart from them. As they worked, they talked. Robert told stories about farming before the plague, about his children who had died, and his wife, who had fled in panic, and whom he had never seen again. Elizabeth spoke about her dreams of becoming a weaver, how she had apprenticed with a master craftswoman before the sickness came and disrupted everything. John described the forge where he had trained, the exacting standards of his master, the pride he had felt in creating something useful with his own hands. These stories were gifts, Thomas realized, offerings of self, invitations to understand and empathize. Each person's past was filled with loss and grief, but also with moments of beauty and accomplishment, with relationships that had mattered and work that had brought meaning. By sharing these memories, they were weaving connections in the present, building bonds that transformed a group of survivors into something more coherent and enduring. One evening, as spring fully established itself and the days grew genuinely warm, Margaret approached Thomas with a proposition. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the future of this place. We've established ourselves here, created the beginnings of something sustainable, but we're still very isolated. We haven't seen another soul since we arrived, and we don't know what's happening in the wider world." "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked, though he thought he knew where this was leading. "That we send out scouts, people who can travel to other communities, if any exist, and establish contact. We could learn whether there are other survivors, whether trade might be possible, whether we're alone or part of a larger recovery." She paused, studying his face. "I was thinking you might be one of those scouts." Thomas felt a complex mixture of emotions. The thought of leaving the monastery, of venturing into unknown territory, was frightening. This hillside had been his entire world for years, but he also felt a stirring of something like excitement, a curiosity about what lay beyond the valley, whether the world he remembered from childhood might be rebuilding itself elsewhere. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you're young and strong, because you can read and write and observe carefully, because you have the temperament for it, cautious, but not paralyzed by fear." Margaret smiled slightly. "And because I think you need to see more of the world. Thomas, you've been confined to this hill for too long. There's value in staying, in maintaining what we've built, but there's also value in moving, in connecting, in remembering that we're part of something larger than just this community." They discussed the plan with the others, and after some debate, the community agreed. Thomas would travel east with John as his companion, following the old roads toward the regional capital. They would be gone for perhaps a month, maybe longer depending on what they found. Their goals were simple: observe, record, make contact with any survivors they encountered, and return with information that could help the monastery community make informed decisions about its future. They set out on a morning in late spring, when the world seemed alive with possibility. John brought tools and trade goods, items they could offer in exchange for information or supplies. They each carried food for 2 weeks and water for 3 days, traveling light so they could move quickly if necessary. The road unfolded before them, winding through country that Thomas had never seen up close. They passed through the ruined village where they had found herbs during winter, past abandoned farmsteads and collapsed barns, through forests that had reclaimed fields and grown wild in the absence of human management. The landscape told a story of sudden abandonment, of lives interrupted and never resumed. But they also saw signs of persistence. Wildflowers bloomed in extraordinary profusion, taking advantage of the cleared land that humans had once cultivated. On the 3rd day, they encountered other travelers. Thomas and John heard them before they saw them, the sound of wheels creaking, voices calling out in warning or encouragement. The two groups stopped when they spotted each other, separated by perhaps 50 yards of road. For a long moment, no one moved. Thomas could see the fear and suspicion in the travelers' faces, and he knew they must be seeing the same wariness reflected in his and John's expressions. This was the calculus of the post-plague world. Every encounter was both an opportunity and a threat, a chance for mutual aid or mutual destruction. Thomas made a decision. He raised his hand in greeting and called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We mean you no harm. We're from a monastery to the west. We're traveling east to learn what we can about other survivors." There was a pause, and then the man at the front of the family group responded, "We're heading east as well, looking for any settlement that's survived, anywhere we might find safety." They approached each other slowly, cautiously, like animals testing whether the other might attack. But when they finally came together on the road, the wariness began to dissolve. The family was exhausted and hungry, clearly struggling, and John immediately offered them some of their food stores. The simple act of generosity seemed to break through the barrier of mutual suspicion, and soon they were talking, sharing information about what each had seen in their travels. The family had come from the south, from a region Thomas barely knew. They spoke of widespread devastation, entire cities abandoned, survivors scattered into small groups that were as likely to be hostile as friendly. But they also mentioned hearing rumors of larger settlements to the east, places where remnant populations had coalesced and were trying to rebuild some semblance of organized society. Thomas and John shared what they knew about the monastery, about the small but stable community they had established there, about their hope of making contact with other groups and perhaps establishing trade or mutual support networks. The family listened with keen interest, and Thomas saw hope kindle in their eyes. The idea that somewhere, people were not just surviving but actually building, actually planning for a future beyond mere subsistence, this seemed to matter deeply to them. They parted with mutual well-wishes, the family continuing east, while Thomas and John resumed their journey. But the encounter had changed something for Thomas. For years, he had seen himself as possibly the last survivor, or at best, one of a tiny remnant clinging to existence in isolated pockets. Now he was beginning to understand that while the catastrophe had been immense, humanity itself had not been extinguished. People endured, they moved, they searched, they hoped. The world was not dead, merely transformed. Over the following weeks, Thomas and John encountered more evidence of survival. They found a village that had been partially reoccupied, a dozen families working together to clear fields and repair buildings. They met a traveling merchant who was attempting to restart trade routes, moving between survivor communities with a cart full of essential goods. They saw a stone church where a priest still conducted services for a small congregation, maintaining ritual and tradition in the face of overwhelming loss. Each encounter added detail to Thomas's understanding of the world beyond the monastery. The picture that emerged was complex, neither the complete devastation he had sometimes imagined, nor the quick recovery he had sometimes hoped for. Instead, there was a slow, painful, uneven process of rebuilding, with pockets of relative stability separated by vast stretches of abandonment and chaos. Some communities were thriving, benefiting from good leadership or fortunate circumstances. Others were barely hanging on, one crop failure or harsh winter away from collapse. Thomas recorded everything in his journal, creating a chronicle that went beyond the monastery's walls to encompass this broader landscape of survival. He wrote about the people they met, the places they saw, the stories they heard. He tried to capture both the hardship and the resilience, the ways that loss had shattered people alongside the ways they were slowly, painstakingly putting themselves back together. When they finally reached the regional capital, they found it partially inhabited. Perhaps a tenth of its pre-plague population remained, clustered in the city's most defensible quarter, behind hastily repaired walls. The survivors had established a kind of proto-government, led by a council of elders who were attempting to maintain order and coordinate the slow work of recovery. Thomas and John spent a week there, meeting with the council, sharing information about the monastery community, learning about the broader efforts at rebuilding. What struck Thomas most was the hunger for knowledge and connection. The council members wanted to know everything: where other survivor communities were located, what resources they had, whether they would be interested in trade or mutual defense pacts. They seemed to understand that isolation was a form of weakness, that the future depended on re-establishing networks of communication and exchange. Thomas's chronicle fascinated them, and they asked if they could make a copy, which Margaret could do when he returned. "What you're doing matters," one of the council members told him, a woman named Helena, who had been a merchant before the plague, and who now served as the group's record keeper. "You're creating memory, maintaining continuity. When people forget what came before, they lose the ability to build on it, to learn from it. Your chronicle is more valuable than you might realize." The words resonated with Thomas, echoing things Brother Michael had said about the importance of preserving knowledge. He thought about all the books in the monastery's library, all the accumulated wisdom of generations, and he understood that his role was not just to survive but to remember, to maintain the thread of culture and learning that connected past to future. They began the journey back to the monastery, traveling through the warming late spring landscape with new purpose and understanding. Thomas carried with him not just his journal full of observations, but also letters from the council to the monastery community, proposals for future cooperation, seeds from crops that had thrived in the capital's gardens, news of other survivor settlements that might be worth contacting. He was no longer just a solitary boy maintaining an empty building, but a participant in something larger, a network of survivors slowly rebuilding the world that had been shattered. When they finally climbed the familiar hill and saw the monastery walls rising before them, Thomas felt a surge of emotion that was part relief and part joy. This was home, and he had been away long enough to appreciate what had been created here. The gates stood open, and he could see figures moving in the courtyard. Robert, tending the fields, Margaret reading in the cloister, Lily playing some game with It was ordinary and domestic and utterly precious. They were welcomed back with celebration and curiosity. The community gathered to hear about their travels, peppering them with questions about what they had seen and whom they had met. Thomas shared his journal, reading passages aloud, and watched as their understanding expanded. As the mental map of their world grew larger and more detailed, Margaret was particularly interested in the council's proposals for cooperation. "This is exactly what we need," she said, studying the letters Thomas had brought back. "Connection, trade, mutual support. We've proven we can sustain ourselves in isolation, but we'll thrive much better with partners." Over the following months, they acted on the information and contacts Thomas had brought back. They sent letters to other communities, established communication networks, began the slow process of rebuilding the web of relationships that had existed before the plague. A merchant came through in summer, bringing goods from the capital and leaving with produce from the monastery, his gardens the first trade transaction in years. A traveling priest stopped for a week, conducting services and bringing news from other religious communities that were attempting to reorganize. The monastery became known as a stable point in the uncertain landscape of the post-plague world, a place where travelers could find shelter and supplies, where information was collected and shared, where the work of recovery was being pursued with thoughtfulness and care. More refugees arrived, and after careful consideration, the community accepted most of them, integrating new members with the same cautious welcome that Thomas had extended to Margaret's group. By the time autumn arrived again, the community had grown to nearly 30 people. They had harvested their first crops from the restored fields, filled the monastery's storerooms with preserved food, made preparations for winter that felt confident rather than desperate. More importantly, they had established themselves as a community rather than just a collection of survivors with shared values, collective decision-making, a sense of common purpose that transcended mere survival. Thomas, now 15, found his role evolving. He was no longer the solitary keeper of a dead institution, but something more complex: a chronicler, a diplomat, a bridge between the monastery's past and its present. Margaret continued to teach him, expanding his education in history and letters and practical affairs. John taught him more metalworking, giving him skills that would be valuable in any future he might choose. Robert shared agricultural knowledge. Elizabeth demonstrated weaving techniques. Anne showed him the basics of healing that she had learned from necessity. But perhaps most importantly, Lily reminded him daily of why all this work mattered. The little girl had grown strong and healthy, and she approached life with an optimism that Thomas found simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring. She had no memory of the world before the plague, knew only the reality of this post-catastrophe existence. Yet she laughed and played and learned and dreamed, unburdened by comparison to a lost past. She represented the future in its purest form, people who would be born into this changed world and would simply accept it as reality, who would build on the foundation that survivors like Thomas were establishing, without mourning what had been lost because they had never known it. One evening, as winter approached once more, Thomas sat in the scriptorium working on his chronicle. He was trying to capture something about hope, not the naive optimism that everything would return to the way it had been, but the harder, more honest hope that insisted life could still have meaning and beauty, even in the wake of catastrophe. He struggled with the words, trying to articulate something that felt true without being maudlin or simplistic. Margaret entered quietly and watched him work for a moment before speaking. "You know, Thomas, when we first arrived here, I thought we were looking for sanctuary, just a place to rest, to hide from the chaos outside. But what we've actually built is something different. Not a refuge from the world, but a foundation for re-entering it, a base from which to rebuild." Thomas looked up from his writing. "Is that what Brother Michael would have wanted, do you think? Not just preservation of what was, but creation of what might be?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that what he wanted was for you to survive, to remember, and then to use what you remembered to build something worth surviving for. And that's exactly what you've done." Thomas thought about this as he returned to his writing. The boy who had barred the gate 3 years ago, terrified and alone, would barely recognize the young man he was becoming. That transformation had not erased his losses or made his grief any less real. He still missed Brother Michael and the other monks. He still carried the weight of being a witness to the end of something that had lasted for centuries. But he had also learned that endings and beginnings were not mutually exclusive, that out of collapse could come construction. that the same hands that laid the dead to rest could also plant seeds for future harvests. He wrote these thoughts into his chronicle, trying to capture the complexity of what he had experienced. Then he added a final passage, one that felt both like a conclusion and an opening. In the depths of catastrophe, when everything seems lost and hope itself feels like a luxury we can no longer afford, there remains one truth that no plague can destroy: that humans are builders by nature. We construct not just houses and walls and physical structures, but communities, relationships, networks of care and meaning that transcend individual survival. The great dying tried to reduce us to isolated atoms, each person alone and terrified, but we have refused that reduction. We have opened doors rather than barring them. We have shared rather than hoarded. We have remembered that our humanity lies not in what we can grab for ourselves, but in what we can create together. This monastery stands as evidence of that refusal, that insistence on connection and community, even in the face of forces that sought to tear such things apart. We are few, and the world remains broken in ways we cannot yet repair. But we are here, and we are building, and that simple fact is itself a form of defiance, a declaration that the story is not over, that new chapters are being written even now. Whoever reads this in the years to come, whether the recovery continues and flourishes, or whether new catastrophes arrive to test us, again know that you are the inheritors of a stubborn hope, a refusal to surrender to despair, even when despair seemed the only reasonable response. We survived, we built, we chose love over fear, community over isolation, hope over hopelessness. May you do the same, whatever challenges your own time brings. May you remember that endings are never final, that in every collapse are the seeds of new creation, and that the work of building a better world is never finished, only handed from one generation to the next. We carried hope through the darkness. Now we pass it to you. Thomas set down his pen and read over what he had written. It was not perfect, but it was true. He closed the journal, preserving the ink, and sat for a moment in the quiet scriptorium, listening to the sounds of the monastery settling down for the night. Tomorrow there would be work to do, fields to tend, animals to feed, repairs to make, plans to discuss. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt and occasions for celebration. But tonight, in this moment, Thomas felt something he had not experienced in years, a profound sense of peace, of rightness, of being exactly where he needed to be. He had been 11 years old when the monks died, a frightened child suddenly alone in a world that had collapsed around him. Now at 15 he was something else, a survivor who had become a builder, a witness who had become a chronicler, a boy who had carried hope through the darkness and had found on the other side not an end but a beginning. The candle flickered beside him, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. And somewhere in the monastery, someone laughed, a bright sound that echoed through the corridors, a reminder that even in the wake of catastrophe, joy remained possible. Thomas smiled, extinguished the candle, and made his way to his cell, ready for sleep and for whatever tomorrow might bring, carrying still the hope that had sustained him, that sustained them all, the hope that insisted the story was not finished, that new chapters were still being written, that the work of rebuilding would continue as long as there were hands willing to build and hearts brave enough to remain open. In the darkness of the hillside monastery, with winter approaching and the world still broken in countless ways, that hope burned on, quiet, stubborn, impossible to extinguish, a light that had been carried through the darkest of times, and that would, with care and courage, be carried forward still, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. A flame that refused to die as long as someone remained willing to tend it, to protect it, to offer it to those who came after as the most precious inheritance of all the knowledge that even after everything ends, something new can begin, and that the simple act of choosing to build rather than to despair is itself a kind of revolution, a quiet transformation of darkness into dawn.